My private lake fence protected more than my property. The HOA found out too late. I never expected a simple wooden fence on my Montana lake property to become the center of a fight with my HOA. I bought my ranch for peace, not conflict. But Rebecca Caldwell believed my fence was standing between her community and the perfect lake view. She removed it despite my warnings. And what happened next forced everyone to ask one question. Was that fence really protecting only my land? Stay with me, because the truth behind those 17 snakes changed everything. If you enjoy real stories about property rights, land battles, and ordinary people standing up with facts instead of anger, subscribe and follow along for more HOA stories. The loudest sound in Silver Pines Estates that afternoon was not a scream. It was the sound of water exploding across concrete as people ran. The luxury lakeside community had been celebrating the opening of what Rebecca Caldwell called a new era for the neighborhood. Families filled the pool deck. Children jumped into the water, and residents stood along the edge admiring the wide-open view of Mercer Lake that had been impossible to see clearly before. Rebecca stood near the pool entrance, wearing a white linen jacket and the same confident smile she used whenever she believed she had won. For weeks, she had told everyone the same thing. The old wooden fence along Daniel Mercer's property line was unnecessary. It blocked the beauty of the lake. It separated neighbors. It made Silver Pines Estates look less like an exclusive community and more like a neighborhood with boundaries. Rebecca had promised that removing it would finally allow everyone to enjoy the lake the way they were supposed to. And that day, surrounded by homeowners who praised her decision, she looked like someone who believed history would remember her as the person who improved Silver Pines forever. Then everything changed. A child near the shallow end suddenly grabbed his mother's arm. "Mom, what is that?" At first, nobody moved. People stared toward the far side of the pool, where the water near the drainage channel had started to ripple. Then someone noticed movement, a dark shape sliding through the water. Then another. The music stopped. A lifeguard blew the emergency whistle. The sound cut through the entire pool area. "Everybody out! Now!" The calm afternoon disappeared in seconds. Parents pulled children from the water. Guests stumbled backward. Chairs scraped against the concrete as people rushed away from the pool deck. Nobody knew how many there were until the emergency response team arrived and counted them. 17. 17 snakes had entered this pool area through the newly opened path connecting the lakeshore vegetation to the community recreation area. The pool was immediately closed. The celebration was over, and standing beside the locked gate, watching workers inspect the area, Rebecca Caldwell no longer looked like the woman who had promised residents a better future. She looked like someone trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. Across the road, on the gravel entrance to Mercer Lake Ranch, Daniel Mercer watched in silence from his pickup truck. He had seen the panic. He had seen the residents looking for someone to blame. And he already knew what they were going to discover. Because 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had warned them. He had told Rebecca exactly what would happen if they removed that fence. She ignored him. Now everyone was finally asking the same question Daniel had been asking from the beginning. Why would anyone remove a barrier protecting a lake community? To understand that, you have to go back before the emergency crews arrived. Back to the day Rebecca Caldwell decided a piece of Daniel Mercer's land was more important than the person who owned it. Daniel never bought Mercer Lake Ranch because he wanted attention. He wanted peace. The 240-acre property in western Montana had been in his family for decades. It was not a vacation property or a status symbol. It was a place where he knew every trail, every section of shoreline, and every change in the landscape. The ranch bordered Silver Pines Estates, a newer luxury community built around the same lake. Most days, the two properties existed peacefully beside each other, until Rebecca decided Daniel's fence was a problem. The fence was old wood, simple and practical. It was not built to make a statement. It marked a boundary. It protected his property. And more importantly, it helped control movement between the wild shoreline and areas where people gathered. Daniel understood the land because that had been his job for years. Before retiring, he worked in county wildlife management. He knew how animals moved, how water channels changed, and how small decisions could create bigger problems later. Rebecca saw only one thing: a blocked view. The first time she approached Daniel, she did not ask. She pointed. "The community would really benefit if that fence was removed," she said. Daniel looked at the fence, then back at her. "It is on my property," Rebecca smiled. "That may be true, Daniel, but it affects everyone." That sentence stayed with him because it revealed the real problem. Rebecca did not see the fence as something Daniel owned. She saw it as something standing in the way of what she wanted. Over the next several weeks, her language became more confident. She told residents the fence hurt the community's appearance. She said removing it would create a more open lake experience. She promised better views and a stronger neighborhood image. But Daniel noticed something else. Rebecca was not just talking about beauty. She was talking about value. She wanted Silver Pines Estates to look more like a private resort. And Daniel's fence was the only thing standing between her vision and his property line. When Daniel refused to remove it, Rebecca stopped treating the issue like a conversation. She started treating it like a battle. The first notice arrived in his mailbox shortly after. An official HOA letter, a demand. Remove the fence within 14 days. Daniel read it twice. Then he placed it on his kitchen table beside his property records. He did not get angry. He did not call Rebecca. He simply started collecting everything. Because Daniel Mercer had learned something during his years working with land disputes. People can argue with opinions. They cannot argue with records. And as Rebecca celebrated the future of Silver Pines Estates, she had no idea that the old fence she wanted gone was connected to something much bigger than appearance. It was connected to ownership. It was connected to history. And soon, it would become the one thing everyone wished had never been removed. The official HOA letter sat on Daniel Mercer's kitchen table for 3 days. He did not throw it away. He did not respond immediately. He studied it. The document looked professional at first glance. Silver Pines Estates letterhead, board signatures, references to community standards, formal language designed to make ordinary homeowners feel like they were already losing. But Daniel had spent enough years dealing with land issues to recognize something important. A document could look powerful without actually having power. The letter demanded that he remove the wooden fence along Mercer Lake within 14 days. The reason? Community visual obstruction. Daniel read that phrase again. A fence on private property was now being described as an obstruction simply because people on the other side wanted a better view. He pulled out the original survey of Mercer Lake Ranch, the property deed, and the maintenance records showing the fence had existed long before Silver Pines Estates was ever built. Everything told the same story. The fence belonged there. The land belonged to him. But Rebecca Caldwell was not interested in what the documents said. She was interested in what she wanted. The next morning, Daniel drove his pickup truck to the Silver Pines Estates clubhouse. He carried a folder. No anger, no threats, just evidence. Rebecca was already there, sitting at the head of the HOA meeting table with 3 board members beside her. She looked confident, almost amused. "Daniel," she said, "I'm glad you came. I was hoping you would understand this is about cooperation." Daniel placed the folder on the table. "I understand exactly what this is about." Rebecca leaned back. "Do you?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "You want something on my property removed because you think it improves the view." The room became quiet. Rebecca smiled slightly. "That's a very simplified way to look at it." "No," Daniel said. "It's the accurate way." He opened the folder. "This fence is documented on my property records. It has existed for years. It does not block access to public land. It does not interfere with drainage. It does not violate any recorded restriction. One board member looked down at this paperwork. Rebecca did not. Instead, she folded her hands. Daniel, Silver Pines Estates was built around this lake. People bought homes here because of the environment. The view matters. Daniel looked at her. A view is not a property right. That sentence changed the mood in the room, because everyone understood what he meant. Rebecca was trying to turn a preference into authority. She wanted the community's desire to become more important than a private owner's rights. The meeting ended without an agreement. But Daniel noticed something as he walked out. Rebecca was not disappointed. She was calculating, and that bothered him more than the letter. People who believed they were right usually argued. People who believed they could force things usually planned. 3 days later, Daniel found out exactly what Rebecca was planning. A new message appeared in his mailbox. Another HOA notice. This time it was not a request. It was a violation. The document claimed the fence had become an unauthorized alteration, affecting the community's appearance. Daniel stood outside his ranch house holding the paper while the afternoon wind moved across the lake. The accusation was false. But that was not the most important part. The important part was the timing. The HOA had known about the fence for years. The previous owners had maintained it. Silver Pines Estates had been built knowing it existed. So why was it suddenly a violation now? Daniel started digging. He spent the next several nights reviewing county records, HOA declarations, and old property documents. He was not looking for a way to fight. He was looking for the truth behind the attack. And he found something interesting. Silver Pines Estates was created after Mercer Lake Ranch had already been established. The HOA documents contained boundaries, shared areas, and community responsibilities. But Daniel found no language giving the HOA control over his shoreline, no authority over his fence, no right to demand removal. That should have ended the issue. Instead, Rebecca escalated. She announced an HOA inspection. A few days later, 3 board members arrived at Daniel's property line. They walked along the fence slowly, taking pictures and making notes. They did not look like neighbors. They looked like inspectors searching for evidence. Daniel stood near the gate. "You are welcome to discuss the property from the road," he said. "But you do not have permission to enter my land." One board member, Dale, looked uncomfortable. Rebecca looked irritated. "We are only documenting community concerns." Daniel pointed toward the survey marker. "Then document the correct boundary." Nobody answered. Because that was the problem. The boundary was not unclear. The boundary was inconvenient. Rebecca looked at the fence again. "You have to understand, Daniel. Sometimes one person's choices affect an entire community." Daniel nodded. "And sometimes an entire community forgets one person owns the land." For the first time, Rebecca's expression changed, only for a second. But Daniel saw it. The confidence was still there. The certainty was not. That night, Daniel called Rachel Morgan. He had heard about her from other property owners who had fought similar disputes. Rachel listened quietly as he explained everything. The demand letter, the violation notice, the inspection, the fence. When Daniel finished, there was a pause. Then Rachel asked one question. "Daniel, did Rebecca ever show you the document that gives the HOA authority over your fence?" "No." "Did anyone from the HOA show you a recorded easement?" "No." "Did they provide a survey showing your fence was outside your property boundary?" "No." Rachel exhaled. "Then they are not fighting a fence." Daniel waited. "They are testing whether they can control your land." Those words stayed with him, because deep down, he already knew she was right. The fence was only the first battle. Rebecca was not trying to remove wood. She was testing whether Daniel Mercer would surrender a piece of his property simply because enough people wanted it. and Daniel had no intention of making that easy. The next morning, Rachel requested the original HOA formation records. She told Daniel there was something buried in old documents that could change everything. Something Rebecca Caldwell either never found or never wanted anyone else to see. Rachel Morgan received the records request response 3 days later. Daniel met her at his ranch office, where the old wooden desk was covered with copies of surveys, HOA declarations, and county maps. Rachel placed a thick envelope on the table. This is everything Silver Pines Estates filed when they were created. Daniel looked at the documents. And? Rachel opened the first folder. And there is a problem for Rebecca. She pulled out the original HOA declaration. Silver Pines Estates had authority over community roads, shared amenities, landscaping standards, and common areas. But when Rachel turned to the property maps, she pointed to the shoreline boundary. This is Mercer Lake Ranch. Daniel leaned closer. The line was clear. The HOA boundary stopped before his property. The fence was not inside Silver Pines Estates. It was not a shared structure. It was not community property. It was his. Rachel tapped the page. They knew. Daniel looked at her. They knew the fence was outside their authority? Yes. That changed everything, because this was no longer a misunderstanding. Rebecca Caldwell had not accidentally crossed a line. She had chosen to cross one. But Rachel was not finished. She pulled out another document. This is even more important. It was a recorded maintenance agreement from years earlier. The document referenced the shoreline boundary and confirmed the existing fence location. A previous HOA board had acknowledged the fence. A previous board had accepted that the structure existed. A previous board had respected the boundary. Daniel stared at the signature page. They approved it. Rachel nodded. Exactly. The same organization now demanding removal had already recognized the fence was legitimate. Rebecca was not enforcing a forgotten rule. She was reversing a decision that had already been settled. Daniel looked out the window toward Mercer Lake. For years, the fence had simply been part of the landscape. Nobody fought about it. Nobody questioned it. Until Rebecca decided the view mattered more than the boundary. Rachel closed the folder. Now we know what we have. Daniel looked back. What we have? Evidence. That word mattered, because Daniel knew something about conflicts like this. The loudest person in the room was not always the strongest. The person with the strongest records usually was. But Rebecca was not ready to give up. The following week, she scheduled the HOA hearing. The notice arrived by certified mail. It was titled, Community Compliance Review. Daniel almost laughed when he saw it. A review of what? A fence that had been documented for years. A boundary the HOA had already acknowledged. He understood what Rebecca was doing. She wanted the appearance of authority. She wanted residents to believe the process itself proved she was right. The hearing took place inside the Silver Pines clubhouse. Rebecca sat at the front of the room. Several homeowners filled the chairs behind her. Daniel noticed something immediately. Many residents looked uncomfortable. They were not there to attack him. They were there because they wanted to understand why a private property dispute had become a community issue. Rebecca started confidently. Silver Pines Estates has always protected the character of this neighborhood. She looked toward Daniel. This fence damages the open lake atmosphere our residents value. Daniel waited. He let her finish. Then Rachel placed the documents on the table. Before we discuss appearance, we need to discuss authority. The room became quiet. Rachel held up the HOA declaration. This association has no recorded authority over Mercer Lake Ranch. Rebecca leaned forward. That is not the issue. Rachel looked at her. It is the entire issue. She placed the boundary map on the table. This fence sits on privately owned land. Rebecca shook her head. The community is affected by it. Rachel nodded. Being affected by something does not create ownership rights. A few residents exchanged looks, because that was the question nobody had asked. Not whether they liked the fence, not whether the view was better without it, whether they had the legal right to remove it. Rebecca tried to regain control. "This is about cooperation," Daniel finally spoke. "No. Cooperation requires both sides to respect the agreement." He pointed to the old approval document. "Your own association recognized this fence." The room went silent. Rebecca looked down at the paper. For the first time, her confidence disappeared. Only briefly, but everyone saw it. Dale, one of the board members, picked up the document. "Rebecca, did we know about this?" Rebecca quickly answered. "That document is outdated." Rachel responded immediately. "It is recorded." That word changed the atmosphere. Recorded. Not a rumor, not an opinion, not a conversation, a legal record. Rebecca looked toward the HOA attorney, sitting quietly at the end of the table. The attorney took the document and read it carefully. Daniel watched his expression change. Because lawyers know something people often forget. A bad argument does not become a good argument because more people support it. The facts still matter. The attorney finally looked at Rebecca. "We need to review this." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "This hearing is about community standards." The attorney did not answer, because everyone in the room understood. The hearing had become something else. It was no longer about whether the fence looked good. It was about whether Rebecca Caldwell had the power she claimed to have. After the meeting, Rachel and Daniel walked back to his truck. "She lost control in there," Rachel said. Daniel looked toward the clubhouse. "She knows?" Rachel nodded. "She knows the documents are a problem." Daniel opened his truck door. "Then why do I feel like this is not over?" Rachel looked back at the clubhouse. "Because people who build their authority on being obeyed rarely stop when the law disagrees with them." The next morning, Daniel found fresh tire tracks near his side gate. The lock was damaged, and the gate was open. Someone had crossed onto his property. Someone had gone exactly where Rebecca Caldwell had been trying to reach from the beginning. The fence line. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of his property that morning, looking at the open gate and the disturbed ground near the wooden posts. He did not touch anything. He did not step forward in anger. He simply took out his phone and started recording. The broken latch, the tire marks, the footprints near the shoreline. Every detail, because Daniel understood something Rebecca did not. The moment someone ignored a boundary, the argument changed. It was no longer about whether a fence looked good. It was about whether someone believed they were allowed to cross onto another person's land. Rachel Morgan arrived less than an hour later. She walked the area carefully, taking notes and photographs. "Did anyone from the HOA have permission to be here?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No." "Did Rebecca contact you?" "No." Rachel looked toward the open gate. "Then this is exactly what we expected." Daniel looked at her. "You expected this?" Rachel nodded. When people lose a legal argument, they sometimes stop trying to win the argument. She looked back at the fence. They try to change the situation instead. That was the moment Daniel realized Rebecca's goal had never been just the fence. The fence was the obstacle. The land behind it was what mattered. Rachel contacted Michael Turner that afternoon. Michael had spent more than 30 years working as a county surveyor before retiring. He knew the history of properties around Mercer Lake better than almost anyone. When Daniel met him at the county records office, Michael arrived carrying a worn leather folder. "I thought this might be about this property someday," Michael said. Daniel looked surprised. "You knew?" Michael smiled slightly. Old land disputes have a way of coming back. Inside the folder were copies of original maps, recorded agreements, and survey notes dating back decades. Michael spread the documents across the table. This is the original Mercer Lake boundary. He pointed to the shoreline. This area was always part of the ranch. Daniel looked closer. The fence line matched. Exactly. Michael pulled out another document. This is the part most people miss. It was a recorded maintenance agreement from before Silver Pines Estates existed. The document recognized the shoreline barrier and specifically referenced the responsibility of maintaining it. Rachel read the page twice. This means the HOA knew. Michael nodded. Previous leadership knew. Daniel looked at the date. Years before Rebecca Caldwell became president. Before she promised residents a better view. Before she called the fence a problem, the evidence showed something simple. The fence was not an unauthorized structure. It was not an accident. It was part of the established relationship between the ranch and the surrounding land. Rebecca had inherited a boundary she did not like, and she decided she could rewrite it. Rachel leaned back. This changes the entire case. Daniel looked at the documents. How? Before, we were proving they lacked authority. She tapped the agreement. Now we can prove they knew they lacked authority. That difference mattered. A mistake could be corrected. A deliberate decision carried consequences. But Daniel still wanted to understand why Rebecca was pushing so hard. So Rachel kept digging. She requested old HOA board minutes, property development plans, marketing materials, anything connected to Silver Pines Estate's growth. 2 days later, she found something. A presentation from a past HOA planning meeting. The title caught Daniel's attention. Future Lake Experience Enhancement. Rachel opened the file. Inside were drawings showing a more open shoreline, better views, improved sightlines, premium lake-facing homes. Daniel stared at the images. They wanted the view. Rachel shook her head. Not just the view. She pointed to the projected property values. They wanted the value that came with the view. The fence was never about appearance. It was about creating a product, a luxury image, a community built around the idea that everyone could enjoy something Daniel legally owned. Rebecca had turned his private boundary into a marketing problem. That evening, Daniel drove back to Mercer Lake Ranch. He stopped beside the fence. For years, it had been ordinary. Just wood, posts, a line between two properties. But now he saw it differently. It represented something bigger. The right of someone to decide what happened on their own land. The next HOA hearing was scheduled for the following week. Rebecca still believed she could win. She sent another notice to Daniel. This time the language was more aggressive. The HOA would proceed with enforcement actions if he refused voluntary removal. Daniel handed the letter to Rachel. She read it silently. Then she looked up. She is doubling down. Daniel nodded. Why? Rachel placed the letter on the table. Because admitting she was wrong would mean admitting she used HOA authority she did not have. Daniel looked at the stack of evidence they had collected. The surveys, the approvals, the recorded documents, the planning files. For the first time since this started, he was not just defending himself. He was building a case. But Rebecca was about to make the mistake that would change everything. Because while Daniel and Rachel were preparing documents, Rebecca was preparing action. The next morning, contractors arrived near Silver Pines Estates, and standing beside them was Rebecca Caldwell. She looked toward Mercer Lake, toward Daniel's fence, toward the one thing she believed was standing between her and the perfect community image she had promised everyone. This time, she was not sending a letter. She was not requesting permission. She was moving forward. Daniel Mercer saw the contractors before they saw him. 2 trucks parked near the edge of Silver Pines Estates, a trailer carrying equipment, 3 workers standing beside the shoreline access area, and next to them, wearing the same confident expression she had worn at every HOA meeting, stood Rebecca Caldwell. For a moment, Daniel simply watched. Not because he was surprised, because he was disappointed. After everything they had uncovered, after the documents Rachel found, after the records proving the fence was legitimate, Rebecca had chosen the one path Daniel hoped she would avoid. She was turning a disagreement into an action. Daniel walked toward the property line. Rebecca noticed him immediately. "Daniel," she said, "I was actually going to contact you." Daniel looked at the equipment. "No, you weren't." Rebecca ignored the comment. "The HOA has made a decision. We are restoring access and improving the lake experience for residents." Daniel looked at the contractors. "By removing something you do not own?" Rebecca's expression tightened. "The fence affects the community." Daniel shook his head. "That does not give you the right to remove it." Rebecca stepped closer. "You keep making this about ownership." "Because it is about ownership." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The workers stood quietly nearby, unsure what they were walking into. Daniel turned toward them. "Did the HOA provide you with permission from the property owner?" One of the contractors looked toward Rebecca. She answered before he could. "This is an HOA-approved project." Daniel looked back at her. "That was not my question." Rebecca did not answer. And that silence told Daniel everything. The contractors had been hired to follow instructions. They had not been given the full story. Daniel pulled out his phone. He began recording. Rebecca noticed. "Are you seriously recording this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because later people tend to remember things differently." That sentence changed the atmosphere. Rebecca had expected anger. She had expected an argument. She had expected Daniel to lose control. Instead, he documented every word, every person, every vehicle, every action. Rachel had warned him. Evidence mattered more than emotion. So Daniel gave Rebecca exactly what she did not want. A complete record. The contractors eventually left after Rebecca spoke with them privately. But Daniel knew this was not over. Because the next morning he found another problem. The side gate near the lower trail was open again. This time, the damage was worse. The latch had been forced. The wooden post beside it showed fresh marks. Daniel stood there for several seconds. Then he called Rachel. When she arrived, she immediately noticed the pattern. "This is not random." Daniel looked toward the lake. "You think they are trying to get through?" Rachel nodded. "They have been focused on this section of the property from the beginning." They followed the trail toward the shoreline. Near the fence, they found fresh tire impressions, not from Daniel's truck, not from ranch equipment. Someone had been there recently. Rachel photographed everything. Then she looked toward the vegetation near the water. "This area matters," Daniel nodded. "It is a natural movement corridor." The words were familiar. He had explained this before. The wetland edge, the shade, the water source. Wildlife followed predictable patterns. The fence was not a decorative barrier. It was part of the way the land functioned. That afternoon, Daniel sent Rebecca another written warning. He attached photographs. He explained the wildlife concerns. He reminded her that opening the barrier could create a direct path from the shoreline into the community recreation area. He asked one simple thing. "Stop." Rebecca's response arrived 2 hours later. It was short. The HOA denied responsibility. They claimed Daniel was exaggerating the risks. They claimed the fence was only being used as an excuse to prevent community improvement. Daniel read the message twice. Then he forwarded it to Rachel. Rachel replied with one sentence. "Save everything." So he did, because something had changed. Before, Rebecca believed this was a fight about appearance. Now Daniel understood something more important. Rebecca needed to prove she was right, even if proving it meant ignoring the evidence. A week later, the HOA held another community meeting. Rebecca stood in front of residents and showed them new images. The open shoreline, the lake view, the improved appearance. She received applause. People liked what they saw. That was the dangerous part. They were looking at the result. They were not looking at what had been removed to create it. Rebecca pointed toward the lake. This is what our community deserves. Daniel sat quietly in the back of the room. He watched residents nod. He watched Rebecca accept praise. And he understood something painful. Sometimes people do not support the wrong decision because they are bad people. Sometimes they support it because they have not seen the cost yet. After the meeting, Linda Parker approached him. She looked uncomfortable. Linda was the HOA treasurer. She had supported Rebecca in the past, but now she looked worried. "Daniel," she said quietly, "can I talk to you?" They stepped away from the crowd. Linda lowered her voice. "I don't think Rebecca is telling everyone everything." Daniel waited. "What do you mean?" Linda looked back toward the clubhouse. "She has been pushing this for months, longer than anyone knows." Daniel felt a shift. What was she planning? Linda hesitated. Then she said, "I don't know everything yet." A pause. "But I think you need to see what's inside the old board files." Daniel looked at her. "Why?" Linda swallowed. "Because I think the fence was never the real goal." That night, Daniel sat at his desk reviewing everything again. The demand letters, the surveys, the photographs, the warnings, and now Linda's statement. The fence had started this fight, but maybe it was only the beginning. The next morning, Daniel received a call from Rachel. Her voice was different, more serious. "Daniel, Linda was right." He stood up. "What did you find?" Rachel paused, then answered. "Something that explains why Rebecca wanted that fence gone so badly." Daniel looked out toward Mercer Lake. The same lake that had started this entire conflict. The same shoreline Rebecca wanted opened. "What is it?" Rachel lowered her voice. Plans." A pause. "Plans that were never shown to the residents." Rachel Morgan said those words quietly, but Daniel Mercer immediately understood they mattered. They were sitting in Daniel's ranch office, surrounded by the evidence they had collected over the last several weeks. The fence documents, the HOA violations, the property surveys, the photographs from the open gate. Everything already showed Rebecca Caldwell had pushed beyond her authority. But Rachel had found something different. Something that explained why Rebecca had been willing to risk everything. She placed a folder on the desk. Inside were planning documents from Silver Pines Estates. Daniel opened the first page. At the top was a title, Silver Pines Lake Enhancement Initiative. He continued reading. The project included shoreline improvements, expanded recreational areas, and future marketing upgrades for lake-facing properties. Rachel pointed to a section near the bottom. "Look at this." Daniel read the projected value increases. The numbers were significant. Homes closest to the lake were expected to become more valuable if residents had uninterrupted views. Daniel looked up. So the fence was not the problem. Rachel shook her head. "No." She turned another page. The fence was blocking the image they wanted to sell. For the first time, Daniel saw the entire picture. Rebecca had not been fighting a piece of wood. She had been fighting a boundary that prevented her from changing the appearance of the lakefront. A boundary that reminded everyone that Mercer Lake was not community property. It was private land. Daniel leaned back. "How many residents know about this?" Rachel looked at him. Based on what Linda found, very few. That explained why so many homeowners supported Rebecca. They were not voting for a property dispute. They were voting for a promise, better views, higher values, a more attractive community. They had never been shown the entire plan. The next day, Daniel met Linda Parker at a small cafe outside town. Linda looked nervous. She had spent years as the HOA treasurer. She knew how the board operated. and she knew what could happen when someone challenged Rebecca. "I should have looked closer," Linda said. Daniel shook his head. "You're looking now." Linda placed a flash drive on the table. "These are copies of board emails and meeting files." Daniel looked at the drive. "What's on it?" Linda hesitated. "Discussions about removing the fence started months before Rebecca sent you the first notice." Daniel stayed quiet. "She told residents it was about improving the view," Linda continued. "But inside the board meetings, they were discussing property values and future development." Rachel reviewed the files that evening. Within hours, she found exactly what they needed: an internal email from Rebecca. The message was short, but the meaning was clear. "Once the shoreline is opened, the community will finally have the lake presentation we need." Rachel looked at Daniel. She knew. Daniel stared at the screen. She knew the fence was not a violation. Yes. She wanted it removed anyway. Rachel nodded. And that was the difference. A mistake could be explained. A decision made after warnings was something else. But before Daniel could use the evidence, Rebecca made her next move. She announced that the fence removal would begin immediately. The HOA sent another notice. This time it stated that the board had approved a community shoreline improvement project. Daniel read the letter carefully. They had changed the language. They were no longer asking him to remove the fence. They were preparing to remove it themselves. Rachel immediately contacted the HOA attorney. Her message was simple. The HOA did not have permission. The HOA did not have authority. The HOA did not have ownership. But Rebecca moved faster. The following morning, Daniel heard vehicles near the lower shoreline. When he arrived, he saw them: contractors, tools, equipment, and Rebecca standing beside them. She looked almost pleased. "Daniel," she said, "I hoped we could avoid another confrontation." Daniel looked at the workers. "You are on my property." Rebecca shook her head. "This area affects the entire community." Daniel looked at her. "That does not answer my question." Rebecca ignored it. "We have followed the proper process." Rachel stepped forward. "No, you followed your own process." Rebecca looked annoyed. "This is an HOA matter." Rachel held up the documents. "No, this is a property matter." For a moment, nobody moved. The contractors looked between Daniel and Rebecca. They had expected a normal HOA project, not a private land dispute. Rebecca finally turned toward them. "Continue." Daniel did not step in front of the workers. He did not raise his voice. He did not create a scene. Instead, he pulled out his phone. He recorded the entire interaction: the vehicles, the workers, Rebecca's instructions, the location, the documents they claimed authorized the work. Every detail. Because Daniel knew the most important part of this fight was not what happened in that moment. It was what could be proven afterward. The contractors removed sections of the fence along the shoreline. The wooden posts that had marked this boundary for years were taken down. Rebecca watched as the view opened. Residents gathered nearby. Some applauded. They saw a wider lake view. They saw open space. They saw exactly what Rebecca promised. But Daniel saw something else: the exposed shoreline, the disturbed vegetation, the open path from the water toward the recreation area. He walked the boundary after the contractors left. Rachel followed. "This is what she wanted," Rachel said. Daniel looked toward the lake. "No," Rachel looked at him. "This was never what she wanted." Daniel pointed toward the open area. "She wanted people to see the lake." A pause. "She forgot the lake sees everything." That night, Daniel organized every piece of evidence: the old agreement, the HOA records, the emails, the photographs, the contractor information, and the warnings he had sent. Rebecca believed she had won because the fence was gone. She believed the community would remember her as the person who opened Silver Pines to the lake. But Daniel knew something she did not. A boundary removed by force does not disappear. It leaves evidence. And 2 weeks later, Rebecca Caldwell would host the biggest pool event of the summer. The same event where she planned to celebrate her victory. The same event where everyone would finally learn what that fence had been protecting them from. Rebecca Caldwell called it the biggest gathering Silver Pines Estates had ever hosted. The invitation went out to every homeowner. A summer lake celebration, a reopened view, a new beginning. The photos from the HOA newsletter showed exactly what Rebecca wanted people to see. The open shoreline, the sparkling water, the uninterrupted view of Mercer Lake. Not a single picture showed the missing fence. Not a single picture showed the warnings Daniel Mercer had sent. Rebecca stood near the pool entrance that afternoon, greeting residents like she was unveiling a major achievement. "This is what community should look like," she told a group of homeowners. People nodded. Some thanked her. Some told her the view was beautiful. And Daniel understood why. They were not seeing the same thing he was seeing. They saw an improvement. He saw a risk. Daniel stood near the edge of Mercer Lake Ranch, watching the activity from a distance. Rachel Morgan stood beside him. "You could have stopped this earlier," she said. Daniel looked at the pool area. "Maybe. But you didn't." "No." Rachel understood why. Daniel had never wanted a dramatic confrontation. He wanted proof. He wanted the facts to speak before anyone could claim he was simply an angry homeowner refusing change. Now the facts were about to arrive. The first sign came quietly. A resident near the pool noticed movement along the drainage channel. At first, nobody paid attention. The area had always been close to nature, a lake community, a wooded shoreline. Wildlife was expected. Then someone saw another one, and another. The mood changed. A few parents started calling their children out of the water. The lifeguard noticed the concern spreading and walked toward the drainage area. Then the whistle blew. One sharp sound. Everyone stopped. Everyone out of the pool. The music continued for a few seconds before someone shut it off. The celebration that Rebecca built around her success disappeared almost instantly. People looked toward the water, then toward the shoreline, then toward the open area where Daniel's fence used to stand. Because everyone remembered. The fence had been there for years, and now it was gone. Emergency crews arrived and secured the pool area. The count surprised everyone. 17 snakes had entered the recreation area through the newly opened path between the lake vegetation and the pool surroundings. The pool was closed. The celebration ended. And suddenly, the same residents who had praised Rebecca's decision were asking different questions. Why was the fence removed? Who approved it? Did anyone know this could happen? Rebecca tried to stay composed. "This is just an unfortunate wildlife issue," she said. But the problem was not just that the snakes appeared. The problem was that Daniel had warned them. Weeks earlier, in writing. Dr. Emily Foster arrived the following morning. She was a wildlife biologist who had studied the area around Mercer Lake for years. She walked the shoreline. She examined the drainage route. She reviewed Daniel's photographs from before the fence was removed. Then she reviewed the new conditions after the removal. Her conclusion was simple. The fence had not created the problem. Removing it had. The barrier had redirected wildlife movement away from the recreation areas. Once it was gone, the natural path changed. The lake corridor connected directly toward the pool area. Dr. Foster prepared a report. And that report changed the entire argument. Because Rebecca had spent weeks saying Daniel was protecting a fence. The evidence showed Daniel had been protecting people. When Rachel received the report, she immediately added it to their case file. The evidence was growing. The original property records, the HOA approvals, the internal emails, the contractor records, now the wildlife report. Rebecca's argument was becoming harder to defend with every document. But Daniel still needed one more thing. He needed to prove that Rebecca knew the risks before she acted. Because a bad decision was one thing. Ignoring a warning was another. That was when Linda Parker came forward. The HOA treasurer had been quiet since the pool incident, but now she had something she could no longer ignore. She contacted Daniel. "Daniel, we need to talk." They met away from Silver Pines Estates. Linda looked exhausted. I should have questioned her earlier. Daniel stayed silent. Linda handed him a folder. Inside were printed emails from HOA board discussions. Daniel read the first page, then the second, then the third. His expression changed, because buried inside those messages was the information everyone needed to see. Rebecca knew. She had received warnings about wildlife movement near the shoreline. She had discussed the fence removal anyway. One email contained a sentence that stopped Daniel. "The residents want the view. We cannot delay this project because of one person's concerns." Rachel read the message later that evening. She looked at Daniel. "This is the turning point." Daniel looked at the evidence spread across the table. For weeks, Rebecca had claimed he was the obstacle, the difficult homeowner, the person standing in the way of progress. Now the records told a different story. She had ignored the person who understood the land. She had ignored the documents. She had ignored the warning. And the community was finally seeing what Daniel had known from the beginning. The fence was never the enemy. The decision to remove it was. The next morning, Sheriff Thomas Hayes called Daniel. "I received a report about the property access issue," the sheriff said. Daniel listened. "The fence removal." "Yes," Thomas paused. "I think it's time we look at the records." Daniel looked toward the lake. The fight had started as a disagreement between a ranch owner and an HOA president. But after 17 snakes entered the pool, it became something much larger. Now there were questions about authority, responsibility, and whether Rebecca Caldwell had crossed a line she could not simply step back over. That was the question Sheriff Thomas Hayes was asking when he arrived at Mercer Lake Ranch the following morning. Daniel Mercer met him near the same shoreline where the fence had stood for years. The sheriff did not arrive with accusations. He arrived with questions. "Daniel, I need to understand exactly what happened." Daniel handed him the organized evidence file Rachel Morgan had helped prepare. Inside were photographs, property records, the original fence documentation, the HOA notices, the removal records, and the warnings Daniel had sent before the fence came down. Sheriff Hayes looked through each document carefully. "This is a lot more than a neighborhood disagreement." Daniel nodded. "That's what I've been trying to explain." The sheriff looked toward the open shoreline. "The fence was on your property?" "Yes." "The HOA had permission to remove it?" "No." Sheriff Hayes closed the folder. "Then we need to find out who made that decision and why." For Daniel, that question mattered, because he already knew what Rebecca wanted. The lake view, the higher property values, the appearance of a luxury community. But now there was a bigger issue. The HOA had ignored warnings, and people had been put at risk because of it. Later that afternoon, Rachel met Daniel at her office. Linda Parker's documents were spread across the table. The internal emails, the board discussions, the planning documents, everything connected to the fence removal. Rachel pointed to the timeline. "Look at this." Daniel leaned closer. The dates were clear. Rebecca had discussed removing the fence months before the official violation notice was ever sent. She planned this before she accused me of violating anything. Rachel nodded. Exactly. That was important, because the violation notice was supposed to be the beginning of a compliance process. But the evidence suggested the decision had already been made. The HOA was not investigating whether the fence violated rules. They were looking for a justification after deciding they wanted it gone. Then Rachel found something else. A message between Rebecca and another board member. The subject line read, "Lake Visibility Strategy." Rachel opened it. Inside was a discussion about future marketing plans. They talked about attracting buyers. They talked about improving the community image. and they talked about the shoreline opening. Daniel read one sentence twice. Once the barrier is removed, the lake will become the defining feature of the neighborhood. He looked up. They were selling the view. Rachel nodded. And your land was part of the picture. That was the moment Daniel understood the entire strategy. Rebecca had convinced residents they were fighting for beauty. But behind closed doors, she was fighting for value. The fence was not blocking a public benefit. It was blocking a private business goal. Meanwhile, Silver Pines Estates was changing. The same residents who once praised Rebecca were now asking questions. The pool closure had affected everyone. Families were frustrated. Parents wanted answers. Homeowners wanted to know why they had never been told about the wildlife warnings. The HOA meeting that followed was unlike any previous meeting. Rebecca walked in expecting support. Instead, she faced silence. One resident stood up. Did you know Daniel warned the board before the fence was removed? Rebecca looked uncomfortable. That information is being taken out of context, another resident responded. Then explain the emails. That was the difference. Before, Rebecca controlled the conversation. Now the documents did. She tried to redirect attention. This was an unexpected wildlife event. But Linda Parker finally spoke. And when she did, the room changed. I was on the board, Linda said. I saw these discussions. Everyone turned toward her. Linda continued. We knew Daniel had concerns. Rebecca looked at her. Linda, be careful. But Linda did not stop. We knew the fence was there for a reason. The room went quiet, because Linda was not a stranger. She was not Daniel's lawyer. She was the HOA treasurer, someone who had been inside the decisions, someone who had seen the records. Rebecca's authority started slipping. Not because Daniel attacked her, not because Rachel argued with her, because someone from inside her own organization revealed the truth. After the meeting, Sheriff Hayes reviewed the new information. He contacted Rachel. There may be enough here to investigate the property access issue. Rachel understood. This was no longer only about whether the fence should have been removed. It was about whether the HOA had exceeded its legal authority. Daniel remained calm through all of it. That surprised some people. They expected him to celebrate Rebecca's problems, but he never wanted revenge. He wanted accountability. The next week, Rachel prepared the final legal strategy. She organized everything into one timeline. The original ownership records, the recorded fence agreement, the HOA limitations, Rebecca's demands, the unauthorized removal, the ignored warnings, the wildlife report, the internal emails. Every decision Rebecca made was now connected. Every claim had an answer. Every accusation had evidence. Rachel looked at Daniel. This is the strongest position we've had. Daniel nodded. What happens next? Rachel closed the file. The hearing. Daniel looked toward Mercer Lake, the same shoreline where the fence had stood, the same place where Rebecca believed she had won. But now the entire story had changed. The fence was no longer just a piece of property. It was evidence. The lake was no longer just a view. It was proof. And Rebecca Caldwell was about to walk into the one room where confidence could not replace facts. The Silver Pines Estates hearing room was filled before the meeting even started. More residents than usual showed up. Some came because of the pool incident. Some came because of the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. And some came because they finally wanted answers. For weeks, Rebecca had controlled the story. She told people Daniel Mercer was resisting progress. She told them the fence was an obstacle. She told them the HOA was protecting the community's future. But now, the residents were no longer hearing one side. They were seeing the documents. Daniel arrived with Rachel Morgan carrying the evidence file. It was not a stack of accusations. It was a timeline. Every decision, every warning, every document, every moment where the truth had been available. Rebecca entered the room with the HOA attorney beside her. She still looked composed, still confident. But Daniel noticed something different. She no longer looked like someone announcing a victory. She looked like someone preparing for a defense. The meeting began with Rebecca speaking first. As president of Silver Pines Estates, my responsibility has always been protecting the interests of this community. She paused. Low. The fence removal project was intended to improve access, appearance, and property value. Several residents listened carefully. That was the argument Rebecca had always used. Community improvement. A phrase that sounded reasonable, until the evidence showed what was hidden behind it. Rachel waited until Rebecca finished. Then she stood. Before this board decides anything further, there are several facts that need to be reviewed. She placed the first document on the table, the original property boundary map. This shows Mercer Lake Ranch ownership lines. She placed another. The HOA declaration. She looked toward the board. This shows exactly what Silver Pines Estates controls. Then she placed a third. The recorded maintenance agreement. The room became quiet. Rachel looked around. This association recognized the fence location years ago. Rebecca immediately interrupted. That document does not represent the current board's position. Rachel turned toward her. That is exactly the problem. She pointed to the document. The current board does not get to erase recorded history because it changes its preference. Nobody spoke, because that was the point Rebecca had never been able to answer. Preferences were not ownership rights. A better view was not a legal claim. Rachel continued. The HOA issued violation notices against Daniel Mercer for a structure it had previously acknowledged. She placed the notices beside the old approval. The association first accepted the fence existed. A pause. Then it decided it wanted the fence gone. The room shifted. Residents looked toward Rebecca. Not with anger yet, with questions. Then Rachel moved to the next section. The internal emails, the lake visibility plans, the marketing discussions. She placed the documents on the table one by one. This was not simply about removing a fence. She looked directly at Rebecca. This was about changing the appearance of a private shoreline to support a development strategy. Rebecca shook her head. That is an unfair interpretation. Rachel nodded. Then let the record speak. She handed copies to the board members. The room became silent as they read. The emails, the projections, the discussions about lake-facing value, the statements about opening the shoreline. Then Rachel presented the final piece, the wildlife report from Dr. Emily Foster. This is why Daniel warned the HOA before the removal. She explained the findings. The fence had created separation between wildlife movement and the recreation area. Removing it changed the path. The 17 snakes at the pool were not random. They were the predictable result of ignoring the warning. A resident near the back of the room raised his hand. Rebecca, did you know about this before the fence was removed? Rebecca looked toward the HOA attorney, then back at the room. We knew there were general concerns, another resident responded. General concerns? His voice was calm. But Daniel sent written warnings. Rebecca did not answer immediately, and that silence mattered, because for the first time, people were not listening to her explanation. They were measuring it against the evidence. Then Linda Parker stood. The room became completely still. Linda had been part of the HOA leadership. She had been the person who handled financial records, the person residents trusted. I need to say something. Rebecca looked at her. Linda. But Linda continued. I supported this board because I believed we were improving the community. She looked down at the documents. But after reviewing everything, I believe we ignored information we should have taken seriously. Rebecca's expression changed. You are making this personal. Linda shook her head. No. She looked around the room. I am making this accurate. That sentence hit harder than any accusation, because it was not coming from Daniel. It was coming from inside the HOA. Rachel then addressed the board. The legal question is simple, she paused. Did the HOA have the authority to remove a private landowner's structure? Nobody answered, because the evidence had already answered. No. The HOA did not own the fence. The HOA did not own the shoreline. The HOA did not have permission. Sheriff Thomas Hayes, who had been reviewing the property access records, stepped forward when asked. I am not here to take sides, he said. I am here because property boundaries and legal authority matter. He looked toward the board. When someone enters private property and removes something without authorization, that requires review. Rebecca finally showed frustration. This has become an attack against me. Daniel looked at her from across the room. For the first time since this started, he spoke. No. The room became quiet. This is not about you. Rebecca looked at him. It is about what happened. Daniel continued. The land was mine before this HOA existed. A pause. The records were there before this argument started. Another pause. And the warnings were there before the damage happened. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The facts were already doing the talking. The hearing continued for hours. By the end, the board had no choice but to suspend the violation against Daniel and begin a formal review of Rebecca's decisions. But the biggest change was not on paper. It was in the room. The residents who once applauded Rebecca's vision were now questioning the person behind it. As people left, Rachel gathered the documents. Daniel looked back at the empty hearing room. She lost. Rachel shook her head slightly. No. Daniel looked at her. She lost control. And that was different, because Rebecca Caldwell still had one final chance to answer for what happened. But now she no longer had the advantage of being believed. She had something much harder. She had to explain the evidence. For weeks, Rebecca Caldwell had controlled the conversation. She had told residents the fence was a problem. She had said Daniel Mercer was refusing to cooperate. She had presented herself as the person protecting Silver Pines Estates. But after the hearing, the story could no longer be controlled. The documents were public, the emails were reviewed, the warnings were known, and the question facing Rebecca was no longer whether people liked the fence. The question was whether the HOA had the right to remove it. The answer was becoming impossible to ignore. The final legal review began the following week. Rachel Morgan represented Daniel. The HOA brought its attorney. Sheriff Thomas Hayes provided the property access records. Michael Turner submitted the historical survey information. Dr. Emily Foster provided her wildlife assessment. And Judge Robert Mitchell reviewed everything. The case was no longer about a neighborhood disagreement. It was about authority, property rights, and whether an organization created to manage a community had gone beyond the limits of its own power. Rachel began with the simplest fact. Mercer Lake Ranch existed before Silver Pines Estates. She placed the original deed before the court. The shoreline was privately owned before this HOA was created. Then she presented the recorded fence agreement. The association recognized this boundary. Next came the violation notices. The HOA later attempted to remove something it had already acknowledged. The evidence created a clear timeline. The fence existed. The HOA knew. Rebecca wanted it removed. The HOA acted anyway. Then came the most damaging part. The internal emails, the documents showing the Lakeview strategy, the discussions about property values, the plans to create a more attractive shoreline image. Rebecca's attorney argued that the HOA was trying to improve the community. But Judge Mitchell asked one question. Can a community improvement project override a private property right? The room went quiet. The attorney looked through the documents. then answered carefully, "No." That single word changed everything, because it was the same argument Daniel had made from the beginning. The HOA could improve its own property. It could manage its own areas, but it could not take control of someone else's land simply because the result was desirable. Then Judge Mitchell reviewed the wildlife evidence. Dr. Emily Foster explained the importance of the original barrier. The fence was not an artificial obstruction creating danger. It was part of the existing separation between the wildlife corridor and the recreation area. She showed the timeline, before removal, after removal. The changes were clear. The risk had increased because the barrier had been removed. Judge Mitchell looked toward Rebecca. Were these warnings provided to the HOA before the removal? Rebecca remained silent for several seconds. Her attorney answered. There were discussions about wildlife concerns. Rachel immediately responded. Not discussions, written warnings. She placed Daniel's emails on the table. Mr. Mercer specifically warned the board that removing the barrier could create exactly the type of access problem that occurred. The judge reviewed the documents. Then he looked back at Rebecca. You had notice. It was not an accusation. It was a conclusion, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. The decision was issued shortly after. The HOA's violations against Daniel Mercer were withdrawn. The removal of the fence was found to have exceeded the association's authority. Silver Pines Estates was ordered to respect the existing property boundaries and prohibited from taking further action affecting Mercer Lake Ranch without proper legal authority. The HOA also agreed to cover costs connected to the unauthorized removal and restoration process. But the biggest consequence was not financial. It was the loss of trust, because residents had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had supported a decision without knowing the full story. They had celebrated an open view without asking what had been removed to create it. Rebecca Caldwell resigned from the HOA board several weeks later. Not because Daniel demanded it. Not because anyone forced her. Because the people who once followed her no longer believed her decisions represented them. Linda Parker helped rebuild the relationship between Silver Pines Estates and Mercer Lake Ranch. The new HOA leadership created stricter procedures. Property boundaries had to be verified. Private structures could not be challenged without proper records. And environmental concerns had to be reviewed before changes were made near the lake. The repaired fence was rebuilt along the original boundary. The same wood, the same location, the same purpose. But it looked different to everyone now. Before, some residents saw it as an obstacle. Now they understood it was a responsibility. Months later, Daniel sat on his back porch overlooking Mercer Lake. The water was calm, the shoreline was quiet, and the fence stood exactly where it belonged. Rachel once asked him if he felt like he had won. Daniel thought about that, because winning was not really the word. He had not wanted Rebecca humiliated. He had not wanted the HOA destroyed. He had wanted one simple thing: respect. Respect for the land. Respect for the records. Respect for the truth. The fight had started because someone believed a better view was worth crossing a boundary. But in the end, everyone learned the same lesson. A property line is not just a mark on a map. It represents responsibility, history, and the right of a person to protect what they have built. Daniel looked across Mercer Lake toward Silver Pines Estates. The community was still there. The neighbors were still there. The lake still connected them. But now there was a better understanding between them. The fence was no longer a symbol of division. It was a reminder that sometimes the thing people want removed is the very thing protecting them. And sometimes justice does not arrive through anger. It arrives through patience.
Through evidence and through someone standing quiet on their own land, knowing the truth will eventually speak for itself. This story shows us a lesson that's easy to forget. Protecting what you have built does not always require anger or conflict. Sometimes it requires patience, careful records, and the courage to let facts lead the way. then your experience shows that a property boundary, a simple fence, and the agreements behind them can represent years of responsibility and trust. When disagreements happen, staying calm and understanding your rights can make a real difference. The strength in this story was found in dignity, patience, and the choice to protect a home and a piece of land without losing respect for others. It reminds us that justice is often quiet and steady, built through truth rather than noise. If you have ever faced a difficult situation with an HOA, a neighbor, or a property issue, share your experience in the comments below. Type yes if you believe staying firm with honesty and respect matters. We'd love to hear your story and learn from the experiences of people who have walked a similar path. If you enjoy this kind of story, consider subscribing and staying with us for more HOA, rent, and land ownership story about perseverance, dignity, and the quiet courage it takes to protect what's matters most.